Hello, everybody, and thanks for watching or listening. I'm Tom, and I'm just going to start reading Chapter 13 of Fat of the Land. It's titled The Second Pemmican War. I'd like to take an opportunity to ask everybody to please subscribe and like, not just my channel, but all the people who put in their time to bring this book together. And I want to thank A. Dave Fox, a.k.a. the Black Carnivore on Instagram, for bringing this all together. So she's kind of the backbone of this whole thing. But we could all use the support, and we'd like to, sort of help unite the whole carnivore tribe, the whole low-carb community. A lot of us could really use the support right now, because ever since this COVID-19 thing came down, viewership is slagging. For some reason, subscribers are mysteriously disappearing as fast as they come in, so people's numbers aren't going up, and all kinds of weird stuff is going on. So anyways, I hope you enjoy the book, and I hope everybody out there feels better, and thanks for being patient with me. Like I said, in chapter 1, I'm not a very good reader, but I think I've come a long way. So anyway, sit back and enjoy a little bit of Vilhjalmar Stefansson's famous book, Fat of the Land. Here we go. The Second Pemmican War, an intercedent strife within the framework of the Second World War, appears, in retrospect, to have been primarily a struggle between theory and testimony. At the beginning of World War II, those familiar with the history of the American frontier, whether in the United States or Canada, took it for granted that in a war of global scale, which necessarily involved deficiencies of transportation, one item in our plan would be to make use of the strikingly American invention, pemmican, so as to provide our troops with the lightest and most compact known of emergency rations. There was talk of food winning the war and of air power winning it. A plane could carry victuals for a large number of people than otherwise if chief dependence were on this food, which had carried the early explorers across the continent, had sustained the fur trade, and had taken balloonists to Gordon Bennett Cup victories and Perry to the pole. It seemed particularly logical that where men would have to carry their food on their backs, they would be supplied with a ration small in bulk, light in weight, and hard to spoil. Easy to prepare if you had a fire, and needing no preparation if you have none. A food, which, as Admiral Perry had said, you could eat at every meal for a year and not become tired of it. But to the bewilderment and consternation of the disagreeables of the history of human diet, it was announced in 1942 that the dietitians had ruled pemmican unsuitable for the use of Army or Navy in any of their services, and the higher-ups in Washington were refusing to honor requests from the officers in the field. For instance, in the Air Transport Command, the pemmican is issued to them so that through lighter provisions they might be able to carry in each plane more men or strategic material. Indirectly, the Second Pemmican War may have cost lives through the want of the best emergency ration in planes at the front. But it differed from the first in that there were no outright massacres. However, feelings ran so high that the struggle, through chiefly of the verbal and wire-pulling sort, was so bitter that the designation, the Second Pemmican War, is at least figuratively justified. A basic difference between the two Pemmican Wars lay in the objectives. The first was a rebellion of businessmen against the dominance of corporations and was in defense of the right of the free trader to use pemmican. The second was a revolt against dietitians. The first was a rebellion of businessmen against the dominance of corporations and was in defense of the right of free traders to use pemmican. The second was a revolt of modern dietitians against the traditional dominance of pemmican as an emergency ration and was in defense of the right of laboratory technicians to prefer the results of their experiments to the testimony of experience. The technicians felt that they knew from its chemistry that the pemmican was not a good food. They had tested it and did not like the taste. They had tasted it and did not like the taste. It was their duty, as they saw it, to protect our soldiers against the unscientific and disagreeable ration. The position taken by the nutritionist was, to say the least, bewildering to students of the frontier history, which had appeared to show that pemmican had moved from one success to another through more than 300 years of rigorous trial, while it supported our plainsmen and became in the fur trade a mainstay of big business. There seemed an inexplicable tradition between the testimony of thousands through centuries and the alleged discoveries of the dictation. But we can see now, when we take stock, that the revolt against what had long been a staple food was not the sudden flare-up that it appeared to be, but instead had been in the making for a long time. Before going on to describe the Second Pemmican War, it will be good to look at it from antecedents, tracing them as far back as possible to show what the declaration of a full-scale war on pemmican in 1942 was the result of protracted and, in a way, logical development. The first, deepest roots of the Pemmican War grew in the soil of racism, which developed slowly with Europeans' growing consciousness that through the mastery of gunpowder as a killing device, the whites were a master race, holding direct or indirect sway over all the lands and peoples that were backward in the use of pistol, musket, and cannon. From the gun-engaged sense of power developed the idea that we are a better race than the others, and that our things are better things than theirs, as a rule. Interesting note about racism in comparison to that earlier statement about Japanese. But anyways, The red man of the American was obviously far inferior to us, for he did not even have inferior guns. He had no guns at all unless we sold them to him. Through this and a number of other causes, he and his way of life were looked down upon. We looked down upon his food and his method of preparing it. So we encountered his pemmican on the Western Plains, and we were predisposed against it. So the avoidance of native foods that there was in the colonial days is a notable exception, or a notable series of them. In early New England, the Plymouth Rock and some of the other settlements came so near starving that they were forced to eat the food of the local natives. Hunger in such good sauce, and the New Englanders had such of this sauce that the Indian victuals tasted good. The scarcity lasted so long that before it was over, the use of the food of the New England Indian had acquired the force of an established food habit. Their use became a national heritage. Roast turkey, corn on the cob, cornbread, pumpkin pie, maple sugar, succotash, and a number of the other dishes that the lowly savage had been adopted. Their use spread throughout our territory as the whites moved westward. To a less, but nevertheless, material extent, there was hardship that first years among the various of the other seaboard colonies, from Nova Scotia and Quebec south to the Carolinas and Georgia. Local foods were adopted somewhat as in New England. Their use spread westward, and the pioneers advanced. But pemmican was not one of these foods, for it did not exist along the seaboard. It was a discovery or invention of the Plains Indians, and had not as yet penetrated east across the Appalachians, though it had, in places, crossed the Rockies. Our people did not come in contact with it. Therefore, during the early period when hunger was at an ever-ready fillip, a period, too, in which the colonists were, to an extent, receptive to new things. They realized that they were in a new world, and so had an inclination to taste new fruits and learn if they were good. In the time before the Louisiana Purchase, only a few of our hardiest and most adaptable crossed the Appalachians and reached the prairies, chiefly to buy furs and to hunt the buffalo. It has already shown how readily these took to jerky and pemmican when they discovered them among the Buffalo Indians. However, it seems likely that the earliest of the Western pioneers may have been the first to launch against the pemmican as a condensed food, the sort of attack that has, in the long run, been the most effective against it. The pemmican Indian were, in the main, exclusive meat eaters, in the sense that if they had enough meat, they ate little or nothing else. By contrast, the Indians along the Atlantic seaboard were largely agricultural. Upon landing, the European colonizers, who were agriculturalists, had found themselves among the people who depended on corn and beans and squash, with the exception of the turkey, the unfamiliar food with which the Indians sustained the colonists through their first year, were in their nature chiefly agriculture. So when the pioneers reached the buffalo hunting and the pemmican using western prairies, they brought with them European taste, slightly modified by the Indian type of the agriculture. They were used to eating potatoes and bread with their never very abundant meat, and to them it would not seem right to follow the custom of the plains to eat straight buffalo, whether fresh or jerky or pemmican. Here reference must be made to the contention of some that before the whites entered the buffalo country, the Indians had no berry pemmican, but used only two ingredients, dried lean and rendered fat. If that was so, if there was no berry pemmican in Nebraska when the New Englanders and the Virginians arrived, they would almost certainly have invented it, introducing berries as a flavoring to make the pemmican seem more familiar through an increase of resemblance of suet pudding. Have to try some suet pudding. Well, suet, very popular, especially with that New York crowd out there. So, but their finding berry pemmican already in use seems that more probable for exclusively buffalo-eating tribes had been, some of them, to a considered extent agriculture before they obtained the horse from the Spaniards, and became so successful as mounted hunters that they saw no further need to piece out their beef meals with garden truck. With their general fondness for the mixed dishes, the whites would naturally have encouraged the Indians to make more berry pemmican, giving a higher price for it in exchange for trade goods. Mincemeat, plum duff, and suet pudding are the foods that the English descendant Americans were most used to in the colonial times. Of those, they resembled pemmican, but these in made up suet and lean meat alone flavor with berries or fruit that they also contain cereal ingredients. Pemmican could therefore be made more like the Europeans were used to if cereal were mixed in. So we began to hear, although not in any extent until past middle or 19th century, that some pemmican contained cornmeal in them. Sorry, some of this text is a little fragmented. So many of those who are used to the plain pemmican are fond of it, and I have brought it out in quotations. But still and all, pemmican is not by nature a dessert or a confection. It is in chief a condensed food, a ration for wayfarers and warriors who need to travel light so that they can move fast and go far. Its claim to excellence is that it gets the maximum energy from minimum weight and bulk. That end is attained by having it in no more protein than there is required for optimum health, deriving all the rest of the energy from fat, 1 ounce of which is as good as 2¼ ounces of either a protein or a carbohydrate. For permanent good health, there is required an irreducible minimum of protein, furnished by the pemmican through its shredded or powdered lean meat. The fat element, however, can be replaced by a carbohydrate, meaning starch or sugar, without impairment of health, but the substitution cannot be made without decreasing the merit of the pemmican as a condensed ration, because every ounce of fat removed will need to be replaced by more than double its weight of starch or sugar. With dried fruits such as berries or raisins, the case is worse, for it takes far more than 2 ounces of raisins to make up in the nourishment for 1 ounce of fat. So there we have the attack on pemmican revealed. By progressively adding more and more fruit, by adding sugar or flour to make the food more nearly European style, the Europeans tended to increase the bulk and weight, which meant that decreasing the advantage of the pemmican has over other foods in being lighter and more compact and given energy value. A so-called pemmican that contains raisins, shredded coconut, pea meal, sugar, and the like is no longer very light or very compact in proportion to energy value, and ceases to have the true pemmican great advantage over other foods. The first step, then, that led the Second Pemmican War, the struggle of 1942 through 45 for the overthrow of pemmican as a dominant condensed ration, was taken by the European, however, and whatever he was, who told the first Indian that pemmican would be better if it had more fruit in it. Of course. I can imagine him saying that. The attack of the adulteration upon the pure travel ration was more serious than has thus far been indicated, for pemmican had a great merit other than the portability in which most of the preservable foods. It is the true pemmican made exclusively of dried lean and rendered fat, considered which we have testimony that was as good after 20 or 30 years as the day it was made. Pemmican which has dried berries in them did not keep well. In comparison, the modern pemmican that contains ground up bacon, shredded coconut, butter, pea meal, and the like spoil quickly. They cannot be used on long summer journeys unless canned. The double attack of the adulteration of portability and preservability of the pemmican has been increasing in effectiveness to the present, and has been of the chief weapon in the hands of revolutionaries of the Second Pemmican War. As shall be shown later by quoting a letter from Surgeon General of the Navy, it has even been possible during World War II first to give the name pemmican to a candy bar which contained not only a great deal of sugar, vegetable oil, and peanuts, but even had chocolate to take the place of the lean beef. And then to get a ruling passed by the Navy on the basis of the candy mixture that the pemmican shall not be used because it is thirst-provoking. A few pages back, I made the point that the Europeans, after becoming lords of the earth through the skillful use of gunpowder, developed the racist idea that we whites are better than folk of the other color, we looking down on the colored people as a general inferior and upon their food as of lower grade. I now return to that argument, considering how pemmican was affected by the idea that it was derived from a people socially benefited us, and that it was therefore a food which it was beneath us to use. Women, at least European women, but no doubt women generally, are sticklers for proprieties. The first whites who reached the plains were generally single men, frequently of the extremely adaptable Kit Carson type, who took readily to the ways of any people among whom they traveled or lived. A good biography of Carson, any good book on the lives of mountain men and plainsmen of the period, shows them living in the best of health in full content on the exclusively meat diet of the larger part of the year. They took readily to pemmican, which became their staff of life, that and jerky. But after the true plainsmen came the agricultural pioneers. They brought their women, who in turn brought with them the idea that Indian food was not good enough for them. They insisted it was not good enough for their husbands either, and certainly not for the children, who were not going to grow up like savages if their mother could help it. One of the many who bring out the attitude of the second string pioneer women is Irene D. Padden. I don't know. Padden. I quote from her excellent book, The Wake of the Prairie Schooner. She has been talking about diet standards of the plains, which were satisfactory to the men, and goes on, this is a quote, "Women, on the other hand, were invariably prejudiced in favor of better variety of food. They carried potatoes, squash, eggs, safely packed in cornmeal, which would be used up as the eggs vanished, rice, preserves, pickles, and other imperishable commodities. Breadstuffs were often carried in barrels. These things, under the firm social guidance of the women, took the place of buffalo steaks and roasts, the jerky and the pemmican that had been the daily food of Kit Carson of the early West. Europeans are used to having fresh meat, and so the use of fresh buffalo meat was in line, and was not strongly opposed by women. But pemmican was distinctly not European. It was an invention of savages, and the white women found it unappetizing, as an unappetizing concoction." That was a quote. Miss Patton sums it up. Pemmican was the standby of the plainsmen, but not so often used by polite society, even in wagon trains. This confection was used after other supplies were gone, but it is said that a man could do a harder day's work on pemmican than on other foods. Bernard Devoto, historian of the frontier, was quoted 2 chapters back, thinks women responsible for the gradual spread through the West of the idea that it was not the thing to eat native foods. He previously mentioned a letter in July 26, 1944. "I know of no complaint about the taste of even the plain dried meat until there are women in the West," after which remarks about the palatability, or more often the unappetizing experience, are common enough. I guess some foods aren't gender neutral. Placing the responsibility not on the women, but rather on the newcomers in general, who bring along their old food habits, Miss Anne M. Henderson of Winnipeg, secretly of the Lord Selkirk Association of Rupert's Land, whatever that is, agrees that pemmican ceases to be used when families begin to move into the plains country, instead of the single men who had come earlier. She thinks as a result the locals suffered, particularly as of scurvy. In a long and valuable letter on the food of the pioneers, she said in 1944. A friend whose family pioneered in Saskatchewan in the early 80s remarked that scurvy was always a nightmare to them. These people coming in from eastern Canada, bringing their own customs with them and insisting upon following them, of course, did not use pemmican. The first attacks on pemmican then were along the line of making it less nourishing and less preservable through the blending of it to make it conform more nearly to the established food habits of the early whites. The first attacks on pemmican, then, were along the line of making it less nourishing and less preservable through the blending it, making it conform more nearly to the established food habits of the early whites. Then came attack based on the sociological and psychological grounds. White women, when they appeared on the plains, opposed it especially. Both men and women tended to oppose it because it was of low native origin. The immigrants were considered by themselves to be of higher mold. Interesting way to put it, right? Higher mold. Sad to say, the next and one of the most effective attacks came from the best friend pemmican recently had, the polar explorer. Quite unintentionally, but more effectively for that they introduced the notion that pemmican is specially suited for use in cold weather. From this dawned the complementary inference that it is not well suited for its use in summer or the tropics. First to fall in with the new attitude, naives of the United States and Britain. Army men like General Chpt, DCN of the United States prairies and General Steele of the Canadian prairies knew pemmican from the Indian and the fur trade. So they recommended it in their books without qualification as to the season, doubtlessly thinking of it really as a summer food, and their experience with it having been mainly in that season. Unlike the Army, the Navy heard of pemmican, it seems, first from the polar explorers, thus with the implication that it was primarily a cold weather diet. The idea was destined to spread wide and deep and to become a serious theoretical handicap to pemmican as all year and all climate food. I have quoted the British Polar Authority, Admiral McClintock, as saying that he and the rest of the explorers of the middle 19th century just ate pemmican and kept in good health. Sir Clements Markham, president of the Royal Geographical Society of London, who looked upon himself as a naval man, criticized the diet of the second Scott expedition as not having had a large enough percentage of pemmican. The literature is full of similar cases. So the British Navy, and definitely favorable, but they were always, as far as I have been able to discover, thinking of pemmican as a winter food, commending it in those terms. The case is the same with the United States Navy. In a long and valuable letter on the food of the pioneers, she said in 1944, A friend whose family pioneered in Saskatchewan in the early 80s remarked that scurvy was always a nightmare to them. These people coming in from eastern Canada, bringing their own customs with them and insisting upon following them, of course, did not use pemmican. The first attacks on pemmican then were along the line of making it less nourishing and less preservable through the blending of it to make it conform more nearly to the established food habits of the early whites. Then came the attack based on the sociological and psychological grounds. White women were then appeared on the plains, opposed it specifically, especially. Wow, start over. This is bottom of the previous page. Okay. The first attacks on pemmican then were along the line of making it less nourishing and less preservable through the blending it, making it conform more nearly to the established food habits of the early whites. Then came attack based on the sociological and psychological grounds. White women, when they appeared on the plains, opposed it especially. Both men and women tended to oppose it because it was of low native origin. The immigrants were considered by themselves to be of higher mold. Interesting way to put it, right? Higher mold. Sad to say, the next and one of the most effective attacks came from the best friend pemmican recently had, the polar explorer. Quite unintentionally, but more effectively for that they introduced the notion that pemmican is specially suited for use in cold weather. From this dawned the complementary inference that it is not well suited for its use in summer or the tropics. First to fall in with the new attitude were the naives of the United States and Britain. Army men like General Chpt, DCN, of the United States prairies, and General Steele of the Canadian prairies knew pemmican from the Indian and the fur trade. So they recommended it in their books without qualification as to the season, doubtlessly thinking of it really as a summer food, and their experience with it having been mainly in that season. Unlike the Army, the Navy heard of pemmican, it seems, first from the polar explorers, thus with the implication that it was primarily a cold weather diet. The idea was destined to spread wide and deep and to become a serious theoretical handicap to pemmican as all year and all climate food. I have quoted the British Polar Authority, Admiral McClintock, as saying that he and the rest of the explorers of the middle 19th century just ate pemmican and kept in good health. Sir Clements Markham, president of the Royal Geographical Society of London, who looked upon himself as a naval man, criticized the diet of the second Scott expedition as not having had a large enough percentage of pemmican. The literature is full of similar cases. So the British Navy, and definitely favorable, but they were always, as far as I have been able to discover, thinking of pemmican as a winter food and commending it in those terms. The case is the same with the United States Navy. She thinks that as a result, the locals suffered, particularly as of scurvy. In a long and vulnerable letter in a long and valuable letter on the food of the pioneers, she said in 1944. A friend whose family pioneered in Saskatchewan in the early 80s remarked that scurvy was always a nightmare to them. These people coming in from eastern Canada, bringing their own customs with them and insisting upon following them, of course, did not use pemmican. The first attacks on pemmican then were along the line of making it less nourishing and less preservable through the blending of it to make it conform more nearly to the established food habits of the early whites. Then came the attack based on the sociological and psychological grounds. White women were then appeared on the plains, opposed it specifically, especially. Wow, start over. This is bottom of the previous page. Okay. The first attacks on pemmican then were along the line of making it less nourishing and less preservable through the blending it, making it conform more nearly to the established food habits of the early whites. Then came attack based on the sociological and psychological grounds. White women, when they appeared on the plains, opposed it especially. Both men and women tended to oppose it because it was of low native origin. The immigrants were considered by themselves to be of higher mold. Interesting way to put it, right? Higher mold. Sad to say, the next and one of the most effective attacks came from the best friend pemmican recently had, the polar explorer. Quite unintentionally, but more effectively for that they introduced the notion that pemmican is specially suited for use in cold weather. From this dawn the complementary inference that it is not well suited for its use in summer or the tropics. First to fall in with the new attitude were the naives of the United States and Britain. Army men like General Chpt, DCN of the United States prairies and General Steele of the Canadian prairies knew pemmican from the Indian and the fur trade, so they recommended it in their books without qualification as to the season, doubtlessly thinking of it really as a summer food, and their experience with it having been mainly in that season. Unlike the Army, the Navy heard of pemmican, it seems, first from the polar explorers, thus with the implication that it was primarily a cold weather diet. The idea was destined to spread wide and deep and to become a serious theoretical handicap to pemmican as all year and all climate food. I have quoted the British Polar Authority Admiral McClintock as saying that he and the rest of the explorers of the middle 19th century just ate pemmican and kept in good health. Sir Clements Markham, president of the Royal Geographical Society of London, who looked upon himself as a naval man, criticized the diet of the second Scott expedition as not having had a large enough percentage of pemmican. The literature is full of similar cases. So the British Navy, and definitely favorable, but they were always, as far as I have been able to discover, thinking of pemmican as a winter food and commending it in those terms. The case is the same with the United States Navy. Rear Admiral Winfield Scott Schley, 1839 to 1911, graduated from Annapolis in 1860 and served through the Civil War, but is most widely known in connection with the Spanish-American War. During 1884, he was in command of an Arctic expedition for the rescue of Lieutenant, later Major General, A.W. Greely. Of this operation, he made an official report and also a popular one through a book, The Rescue of Greely, which he signed jointly by Schley and by Professor R. Soley, 1850 to 1911, who graduated from Harvard in 1870, was head of Department of History and Law at the United States Naval Academy, 1972 to 1882, and was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1890 and 1993. I wrote from page 132, in quotation, the pemmican, which is always the most nutritious of foods in the most compact form for Arctic work, was packed in 1 and 2 pound cans and boxes, and it is palatable and wholesome and may be eaten from the can or cut into cakes and fried. A good many sportsmen were buying pemmican and continuing its summer use. The like may be said of a few balloonists, but by general public and little of this much one polar explorer after another who varied from the discreetly lyrical to the dithyrambic in praise, but always in connection with cold weather, for that was when sledge journeys were made. Indeed, the brief spread among the polar explorers themselves, the pemmican was a cold weather food primarily. Moreover, there grew up in the late 19th century, or was much strengthened, a view which has continued gaining prestige in the 20th, that food rich in fat are not suitable for warm weather. That view was discussed in the chapter Living on Fat of the Land, where it was shown that this folk belief is not merely of recent origin and confined geographically to certain districts, but also that it is contradicted by the general knowledge of the very people who hold the belief. In any case, we of the United States, Canada, and Northern Europe are passing just now through a phase of modern dietetic theory in which it is commonly accepted that fats are not desired in summer and that they are not desirable in summer, or in the tropics where it is always summer. When the standard blends derive from 70% to 90% of their energy units from fat, it is obvious that no one is going to favor pemmican as a summer diet if he believes that fat is undesirable in warm weather. But if it follows that these same people are going to think it comparatively good as a winter diet, the error are reciprocal. To think that the fat particularly undesirable on a hot day and to think that it is particularly desirable on a cold one. This theoretical attack, however, merely demotes pemmican from an all-weather food to a winter food, or theoretical attacks prove more serious in that their condemnation did not fluctuate with the season. During the last 2 or 3 generations, there has been a growth and spread of belief that in order to be healthy, one needs a varied diet. According to this view, as it stands now, one should have every day, or at the least every week, a little fruit, a little cereal, a little egg, a little milk, a little green vegetable, a little yellow vegetable, a little red meat, a little fish, and so on. Now, there is no variety in pemmican, no cereal, no fruit, no milk. So, by the current theory, one cannot be healthy on it. Testimony that thousands of people a year for hundreds of years have been healthy on pemmican does not mean a thing to a person if he is sufficiently convinced, as most people are, that a varied diet is essential to health. So one dismisses a fiction that alleged fat of those who say it is feasible to remain in good health permanently on exclusive meat, or he explains them away, feeling there must have been this, that, or the other modifying condition. Then when one has proved himself to, by reviewing the theory, the pemmican is not a good exclusive food, he feels inclined to extend the reasoning and conclude that neither can it be much good as an element in a mixed diet. One of the acclaimed discoveries a few decades back was that crystallization by the slogan, "Fat burns only in the flames of carbohydrate." This was interpreted to mean that the human body could not utilize fat without the help of carbohydrate. Amplified, it meant that if one ate a little of the fat, he had to eat a lot of carbohydrate to help use that fat. This doctrine turned out to be a foundation for most serious of all theoretical attacks on pemmican, for the standard blend of the fur trade contained no carbohydrates except the tiny amount that is in the meat. So the fat, which from chemists' point of view represented 75% to 80% of the energy units, was scarcely usable at all. By their theory, because of the lack of carbohydrate with which to burn the fat, an extreme deduction would be that about all the energy the human body can obtain from pemmican is what can be got out of the lean. The body has thus unable to utilize only 20% of the 25% of the theoretical energy contained in a unit of pemmican. In the emotional heat of the Second Pemmican War, some of the dietitians' opponents have been taking this very stand. In a sense, it is an outgrowth of the fat burns only theory to claim that acidosis or ketosis will develop when there is too high a percentage of fat in pemmican. Dietitians, the last few years, have varied in their estimations of what too high means in this connection. Some say that 30% is permissible, while others go to 40% or 50%. Those who consider themselves very liberal permit 60% of energy units derivable from fat. Even that, the liberal top estimate falls well below the fat content level of fur trade or pemmicans. Here I repeat what has been said in other connections, that when two of us were living on the Russell Sage Institution on an exclusive fresh meat diet, and when we chose to eat meal between fat and lean according to our taste at the moment, with nothing to choose from between except lean and fat, we selected our food so that, in the opinion of the supervising technician, we were deriving 75% to 80% of our calories from fat, the remainder from the lean. Thus, by trial and error, we arrived in New York at the same proportion of fat and lean which had arrived at in the same way for the Plains Indians in their compounding of pemmican centuries before. But as said, this means nothing to those who are really convinced, as most dietitians are, that high percentages of fat in meal is not desirable. However, it should be noted that, although much of the current opposition to pemmican is traceable to the theory that fat burns only in the flame of carbohydrate, it is also true that the theory it began to give ground a few years ago. A living physiologist who does not seem to admire dietitians as a class told me that while I was composing this chapter that he considered even a dietitian's blamedly slow on the uptake if he held this theory later than 1942, he should have dropped it somewhat earlier. For a nutritionist who holds to fat burns only, there appears to be no way of escape open if he tries to reconcile his theory with the experience of pemmican users and of exclusive meat eaters generally. However, once the theory is jettisoned and reconciliation can be attained by suggesting that the diet on which ketosis troubles have been observed, when fat gave only 40% or 50% of the total number of energy units, were diets which contained carbohydrates as well as fats. The carbohydrates could then be made the villains of the piece by saying that instead of being useful in handling the fat, they are, as a matter of fact, harmful. That fats are most effectively usable when they are only two main elements in the diet, fats and proteins. Then when there are three fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. This appeared such a common sense idea that letters were written to several leading physiologists to get their views on it. Most of them replied that they did not as yet fully understand the interrelations of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins in the human alimentation. They were also inclined to feel that since ketosis has often been reported troublesome on mixed diets when no more than 50% or 60% of the calories are derived from fat, but not troublesome on all meat diets even when the fat yields 75% to 80% of the calories. It seems likely that the presence of carbohydrates does not interfere with the utilization of fat. Or, putting it the other way, what replacing carbohydrates in a meal with protein may facilitate the body's use of fat? It's very interesting that people in the 40s weren't pursuing ketosis. It seemed like ketosis is viewed as sort of a bad thing back then. Interesting. I suppose that has to do with being confused with ketoacidosis. Anyways, moving on. Most of the communications received are, on this point, fairly summarized in a paragraph from the letter written April 17, 1944, by a commanding authority in the field, Dr. Walter B. Cannon, Harvard professor emeritus of physiology and former president of the American Association of the Advancement of Science. Quote, "It seems to me possible that the specific dynamic action of protein may accelerate metabolism to such a degree as to permit in an all-meat diet a larger intake of fat without ketosis than it is possible with a mixed diet." End quote. Very interesting that we see that ketosis is necessarily reduced even in a high fat percentage on an all-meat diet. Continuing on. It seems permissible also to suggest that while there is an indispensable thing in a diet, protein, that two other chief elements of the conventional diet, fats and carbohydrates, are not both then needed, but are reciprocal, in the sense that the less carbohydrate one eats, the more fat he has room for, and vice versa. So they knew this a long time ago. The impression must not be given that in 1942 to 45, war against pemmican was fought solely by the Army, Navy, dietitians, and nutritionists. They were supported, for instance, by some of the chemists, biologists of the meat industry. It appears that in recent years, notable advances have been made in the study of enzymes. One of the conclusions being that rancidity will develop in fat tallow if the air has access to it. Particularly, it seems, if no salt is used as a preservative and if the weather is warm. So when the packers were asked to furnish unsalted, uncanned pemmican, they demurred. For their technical men knew what it was, what would not keep. One of the leading scientists of the industry went on record to support one of the leading scientists of the Quartermaster General, to the effect that until they discovered a method of controlling certain enzymes, pemmican would have to be canned to keep it from going rancid during summer. There was, however, no such unity, real or seeing, among the scientists of the meat industry as among those of the Army, perhaps a matter of discipline, for there were men high in Chicago positions who questioned the infallibility of the enzyme conclusion of the research workers. There was, for instance, Colonel Edward Norris Wentworth, Director of Armor, Livestock Bureau. He knew of the unsealed container of rendered mutton fat, which had remained on a shelf in Florida home for more than 20 years without going rancid. Colonel Wentworth thought beef fat might do almost or quite as well. So he kept open in his office several cans of beef pemmican, which his company canned in 1942. He meant to keep them there indefinitely, but wrote in 1944, inadvertently, he got them emptied through his own nibbling at the contents and of his friends. However, this last open can did not become empty for more than a year of Chicago summer heat and ordinary winter office temperature. The final chunk he nibbled at showed no sign of rancidity. In the summer of 1943, when emotions generated by the row within the United States Army between the theory and the experience school regarding pemmican were at or above prevailing June temperatures, one of the tropical advisors of the Quartermaster General, Earl Parker Hansen, found himself in hot water, to keep up with the warm similes, over his belief, gathering through many years of travel and residence in different places of the tropics, that people are just as likely to enjoy fat in weather which is hot and humid as in other climates. He asked him for a statement which he kindly supplied through a letter dated February 20th, 1944. Because it seemed even more interesting over the side of general principle than in the specific bearing of pemmican, I used the full text in the chapter, Living on the Fat of the Land. I comment on the letter from here, the pemmican side. The test covered 9 weeks in June, July, and August. Some of the time was spent in New York, but most of it in Washington, which at that time of year is one of the most distressingly hot and humid places in the United States. So this was a trial both of pemmican as an exclusive food or its sustainability in a climate which in previous years Hansen had fought a little warmer than, quite as damp as anything he had ever seen in 2 full years spent going up and down the Orinoco and the Amazon. The Hansen letter refers to a trait of pemmican, which I have indeed emphasized, and in beginning its use, even one has eaten so much that any more would produce nausea, the stomach, in parentheses, large through the habitual use of bulky foods, in parentheses, still craves more as a filling. This tends towards overeating and the resulting nausea. Pausing at the top of 291 for a breath and a sip. Okay, continuing on top of 291. Then there is a visual difficulty about realizing that what you are going to eat is really a square meal, as Perry has it, in quotations. When pemmican ration was dealt out and I saw my little half-pound lump about as large as the bottom third of an ordinary drinking glass, then he could not realize that he was going to get a square meal, even though he had frequently been satiated by the little amount in the past. By the time I had finished the last morsel, I would not have walked around the completed igloo for any time or anything that the St. Regis Blackstone or the Palace Hotel could have put before me. The tiny lump always did satisfy him, no matter how hungry he was, but it was hard for him to remember this the next day. Experienced men in Perry's situation is that they eat more than he did, perhaps a lump as big as 2/3 of a water tumbler, and then they are nauseated. Hansen solved this difficulty by eating small amounts, each of which would temporarily satisfy him. After 5 or 6 days on exclusive pemmican and unsweetened tea, Hansen found himself eating per day about three-quarters of a pound of blend that derived 80% of its calories from fat. The remainder from lean beef, with the quantity in those proportions he felt well fed and at ease. He tried another blend, where the calories are 60% from fat and the rest from lean. Of this he ate a full pound a day, 4 ounces more than the other day, and had a vague discomfort from which he came to recognize as a sign that he needed a higher fat ratio. He discovered that sense of well-being when he shifted to a quarter pound less of the 80-20 blend. If any reader wishes to follow up on the close attention to this detail, he had better review the full Hansen text on page 135 through 142. That there is likelihood of overeating when men are unused to pemmican has always been the chief trouble while it is being introduced. For instance, in the blue books of the British government, which tell about the Franklin search expedition of the middle 19th century, there are reported frequently complaints by sailors, novices to those foods, that when they ate a little pemmican, it took away their appetite, but both for more pemmican and for other foods, which they understood to show that pemmican was not a suitable diet. There are complaints in the blue books also that when the full ration assigned to the sailors was consumed, the men were nauseated. This is hardly a wonder. Mr. Hansen found that he could do moderately hard work on 9/10 of a pound a day, and nothing else but water. But some of these British rations were as high as 1 1/4 pounds of pemmican, with other foods in addition, which brought the total up to around 2.5 pounds, even 3 pounds. The sailors were inclined to eat the whole ration, for its bulk was no more than what they were used to having in their stomachs. Doubtless somewhat less, but by the time they had filled the accustomed space, they had eaten too much. One of the reasons sometimes assigned for nutritionists' opposition to pemmican within the Army is that it requires an excessive drinking of water. I have corresponded on this with both a number of more prominent physiologists, several of whom have answered to the effect that we have not the necessary information to say whether a ration composed, for instance, of nothing but pemmican, made by the usual 80-20 formula, would call for more or less drinking water than an Army K ration. At this stage of the inquiry, it was called to my attention that the United States Navy had issued an order against the use of pemmican on the ground that it required excessive water consumption. There was press dispatch about it, and which had wide circulation and which may have had a number of sources, perhaps some of them outside the Navy. One form of this statement was, quotation, "During the process of digestion of foods such as pemmican and chocolate, certain salts are formed that require a considerable water for the elimination, thus increasing the rate of dehydration of the body. Therefore, it's requested that the following changes in aeronautical emergency food rations be accomplished as soon as practical. Remove all pemmican and chocolate." Of course, who can have pemmican without chocolate, right? On the basis of this press release, a letter was written to the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery of the Navy Department. A reply came which was signed by Vice Admiral Ross T. McIntyre, Surgeon General of the Navy, dated March 16, 1944. This letter in answer to ours of March 3, 1944. In it, you ask concerning the question for removing pemmican and chocolate from the Navy aircraft emergency ration. You also asked for a formula of pemmican and inquired why the Navy used the term for such a project. The statement which you quote concerning the reason for the removal of pemmican and chocolate for the aircraft emergency ration appeared also in Naval Aviation News for March 1st, 1944. The reason presented therein is not the correct one. Actually, these two items were removed from the ration because the majority of reports indicate that pemmican is difficult to swallow when the mouth is dry, and that the chocolate increases thirst as well as being distasteful to some. Some people don't like chocolate? Really? Anyways, 1 3/4 ounce can of each of 3 slightly different types of pemmican was formerly provided in the aircraft emergency ration. The formulae for these three types follows Schedule 5217, Bureau of Supplies and Accounts. The figures given in the table represented by the weight of the ingredients. There's a table here, and the table, the first column consists of a list: rendered kidney fat, prime oleo oil, seedless raisins, evaporated apples, crisp bacon, peanuts, dextrose, shredded coconut, vanilla extract, and salt. So those are the various ingredients. And then there's three more columns that tell you the ratio. So class 1 there's class 1, 2, and 3. They all have different ratios of these ingredients. So as you can imagine, these are all various combinations of so-called pemmican containing rendered kidney fat, which most of us would call suet. But this prime oleo oil, it's OLEO oil. I have to look that up, I don't know. But there's a lot of, obviously, raisins, evaporated apples, bacon, peanut, dextrose, shredded coconut, vanilla extract, and salt. And of course, dextrose is just a form of sugar. And in every single case, there's 15 units of dextrose in all three of these types. And there's also 25 units of shredded coconut and 30 units of raisins. And then 9 units of the kidney fat, 6 units of the oil, evaporated apples only in one type, and then vanilla extract in all of them, and then salt in all of them. So 1 unit, so presumably 1%. These are percentage units. So just to give you some idea that they had these different types of so-called pemmican that were full of carbohydrates. It is not clear from our records whether the designation pemmican was given these products by the Navy or whatever the experimental samples were already so designated by Armour and Company when they were first supplied to this bureau in 1938. This letter shows that the Navy had not been using pemmican at all in the sense of an exclusive meat preparation, but had been using instead a sort of candy bar, which was no doubt the invention of some dietitian, and to which the name pemmican had been given by somebody. That is a danger with a famous name of good repute. It is likely to be taken and used for the promotion of new things, which it may or may not turn out to be good, but which, in case, are not the same thing as the original. As mentioned, I had been corresponding with physiologists, trying to find why pemmican, also so commonly alleged to be thirst-provoking, and had received letters from several of them to the effect that not enough was known about pemmican and that the applicable physiology to make a decision for or against. Newspaper reports made it seem that the Navy actually had made the needed studies. McIntyre's letter shows that what the Navy had been working on was not pemmican, that the concoction found by them hard to swallow was instead a mixture wherein raisins, shredded coconut, dried apples were by weight the chief ingredients, and that the food specifically charged by the Navy was being thirst-provoking was not any meat preparation but chocolate. During the early part of the Second World War, when recommendations were first made to the Office of Quartermaster General, the pemmican be issued as a meat component of mixed rations, and also for the exclusive use in the survival rations, their development, the situation which I call the Second Pemmican War. The nutritionists voted pemmican and set about inventing substitute condensed rations, which proved far bulkier and more complicated, but which met the current dietitian's theories through having a variety, little fat, and usually not much lean meat either. In the Army pemmican dispute, one of the biggest issues was, in reality, only a difference in point of view as to the degree of palatability desired in a survival ration. The opponents of pemmican said that it was tasteless and unattractive, and that even life and death rations should be appetizing. The pemmican advocates took the opposition standing, maintaining that when you are on a limited allowance, getting less to eat than you would like, and are constantly hungry, then it is folly to make the little you do get tantalizingly attractive. They maintain that it is such case a ration should be only mildly agreeable, like roast beef, bread, or pemmican. There should be no confectionery sort of appeal, but only the urge which drives from need. The moral strain of saving rations against tomorrow, they contended, is always serious with a hungry man. It should be further increased by deliberate appeal to the palate. The suggestion has been made for that the average taste pemmican improved by adding to it 1% of salt. The fans oppose this, for on the grounds that, for an emergency ration, increasing the palatability is a disadvantage. And secondly, because pemmican might be needed on a life raft or in a desert, whereupon saltiness would be harmful. But they point out if pemmican is being used as an ingredient in a mixed ration, and when conditions allow, then it can be seasoned to taste and will naturally be flavored by whatever addition there are to it. For instance, onions, when available and desired. In the early part of World War II, some Army officers, chiefly those familiar with the history of pemmican on the plains, in the fur trade, and exploration requested it for the use of their own commands. One case was that of a colonel who during 1942 sent in a requisition for pemmican and was told that a much better ration would be forthcoming. When months passed and no rations came, which seemed good enough to be a reasonable substitute, he made a second request, and with the same information that pemmican was not suitable and that a better ration would be supplied. In 1943, when the colonel had become a general, he made a third request, whereupon Washington ordered from Chicago something like 20,000 pounds. However, the order specified that the second-grade beef should be used and directed that information describing the contents as of second-grade material should be plainly marked upon each container. Those familiar with pemmican were surprised to see that a satisfactory reception this lot received when it was delivered. The experts had two main fears. Some were afraid that the men would be prejudiced against the batch on account of the second-grade stamp, which appeared large on every can. Others thought an even more serious drawback that the fat component was extremely oily. The manufacturers, with the best intentions in the world, had deliberately used oily fat, their theory being that the pemmican would be for more extreme cold weather and would not be so difficult to handle as if it were made of harder fat. What this commanding officer wanted with pemmican, it seems, was to increase the payload of his transport airplanes, for he was in air transport command. Their regulations required that each plane had to carry a 10-day supply for every man on board. There is a really material difference between a 10-day pemmican ration of 10 pounds per man and a 10-day K ration of more than 20 pounds. When the saving per man is multiplied by the number of men aboard a large army transport, crew and passengers alike counted. I have forgotten how many more passengers per day the general told me he could carry on the average when he had shifted from K rations to pemmican, but it was a heartening figure. The complaint about too soft a fat mentioned a lot in the pemmican brought forth comments from one of the representatives of the packing industry. It seemed strange to him that, with regard to other fats, the War Department had frequently requested that the industry to make tests on desirable blends and desirable methods of packing, but that no such request had ever been made. So far as he knew, with regard to pemmican, in fact, whenever the industry received an order for pemmican, so far as he knew, it was always a hurry-up order, and each small lot had to be made under conditions which were not as good as if more time had been allowed. Especially the results were not as good if tests had been made to determine the optimal preparation method, blends, and packaging. The scientists from the packing industry took a position with regard to beef pemmican that was common with the users of its buffalo prototype. He emphasized that there is pemmican and pemmican, as wide a range of quality as in any other ordinary food, and as much thought and care needed for good results. Those who favored the use of pemmican by the United States Army in World War II made the recommendation of various sorts, but they all had this in common. They considered pemmican a well-known food, of which large amounts should be ordered immediately, on one or more of the standard formulas, and that the pemmican should be sent out for use in any country at any season whenever transportation was an important factor. Countering this was the Army's nutritionists maintained that the position that so far as the Army was concerned, pemmican was an unknown food. It would be necessary to determine whether soldiers liked it and whether they could keep their health on it, etc. In any case, it had the drawback that maintained that it was unsuited for summer use and for the tropics. Those who wanted pemmican to be used did not want the proposed tests made, for they believed them to be stalling devices, with the dietitians hoping that the men would overeat and be nauseated, then testify that the food made them ill, and things of that sort. Anyway, said proponents, what can be learned in a few days or few weeks by tests on a few men that would not already be known from the century-long experience of thousands? Generally, those nutritionists who tasted pemmicans, they disliked it as much as they disbelieved in its merits. They felt sure that soldiers would refuse to eat it and proceeded to the testing with that confidence. The tests bore them out, and conclusions were formed by the nutritionists at the end, which resembled the theories which they had held at the beginning. For the United States Army, they were somewhat qualified. However, as well appeared through a letter from the Office of Quartermaster General dated July 26, 1944. From this, I quote the applicable section. This will acknowledge your letter of 15 July requesting information on the reason for rejecting pemmican for the use of the Army of the United States. The results of ration tests which mentioned are classified information and they cannot be released to publication. Probably the most important reason for not including pemmican in the special or emergency rations by the Army is its lack of palatability. Our experience thus far has been that most troops do not like pemmican, and in many cases, they will go hungry rather than eat it. The chief purpose of special ration or emergency ration is to provide soldiers with food in a compact form which will keep them in condition to fight and work when ordinary food cannot be provided. Obviously, this purpose is not achieved when the men fail to eat the ration. From a nutritional standpoint, other reasons might be mentioned for not including pemmican in Army rations. Some of the reasons may be controversial, and a consideration of such reason in which this letter is unnecessary, since the lack of palatability of pemmican, in our opinion, is sufficient reason for its rejection. At this point, the main concern is to bring out the striking difference of recent test results from those previous experiences. It's interesting to talk about it not being palatable. I've eaten a lot of pemmican lately, and I find it quite palatable. I don't know why people wouldn't like it. As has just been shown, the verdict against pemmican by the quartermaster was based on lack of palatability. So for purposes of contrast, reference is again made in Chittenden, a general in the United States Army, who after decades of experience and it formed a very palatable as well as nutritious food, and to Admiral Perry of the United States Navy, who said after pemmican had been taken him during several different expeditions to the far tip of Greenland, to that of the North Pole, and to many other places, that it was the only food to him that a man can enjoy at every meal, every day, for a year, and have the last mouthful taste as good as the first. And it is the most satisfying food I know. On with a never-ending saga about how pemmican is awesome, and government bureaucracies and dietitians screwed everything up. Thank you, Ansel Keys. There is no doubt I know it, for instance, from conversations with several officers who have been in charge of the test, that the nutritionists of the Army have been able to find a considerable number of men who say that they do not like the taste of pemmican, and some who have gone as much as 3 days on short rations rather than eat it. Now, the testimony I have adduced from the palatability of this food is mostly from books, and therefore from men that the majority of them belong to past generations. It has been suggested, though heartily in conformity with ordinary views of human evolution, that a physiological change may have taken place the last decades through which sons do not like and cannot maintain their strength on foods that were palatable, wholesome, and sustaining to their grandfathers and even to their fathers. With this in mind, I looked around for somebody comparatively young who nevertheless has had a wide experience with pemmican and found him in the Harvard class of 1933, thus belonging to an age group which was furnished a preponderance of majors and colonels in World War II. Princeton Gilbert Downs was in 1944 a civilian topographer for the United States Army Corps of Engineers. During the preceding decade, he had made several frontier journeys. These, since he is a teacher by profession, were during the summer vacations that are customary in American colleges, so they were summer journeys. Those of them on which he had most occasion to use pemmican were in the forest country west of Hudson Bay, where summers are hot and filled with mosquitoes, and with portage that subject the canoe traveler to the severest drudgery, as described in a previous chapter through the quotation from Ballantyne. Here was a man of Eastern College type, a traveler in the pemmican section of Manitoba, who was of an age comparable with the soldiers that were reported by the dietitians as disliking pemmican. So, for possible testimony, I consulted a book written by Downs, Sleeping Island, which had been published when the war was already in progress, thus contemporaneous with the Army ration trials. I did find on page 190 through 191 a description of pemmican and a discussion of its qualities. Downs said in his conclusion, "The pemmican is an important staple of the part of the North. It is the most delicious and sustaining food for the trail that exists. In the early days of the fur trade, the voyagers existed almost solely on pemmican, except the through which it is implied by saying that the fur traders used it to live almost wholly on pemmican during the summer journeys. Downs has nothing in the book on whether pemmican is wholesome and sustaining in the long run." So I wrote him at this point. He replied at length in a letter dated from the office of the Chief of the Air Corps of the United States Army, May 9th, 1943. From this, I take extracts that bear directly on the two main issues, palatability and the maintenance of health and strength. Quote, "I always made every effort to secure pemmican. It has been my experience that nothing else is so particular and satisfactory. The Chippewyans made 2 grades, of course with less fat content and a finer with more fat content. The latter is, of course, the choice and most nourishing. My own use of pemmican has always been somewhat constrained by lack of supply. I have never been so fortunate as to have enough. That is all I wanted and enough for 4 meals in the working day. It was customary to eat available fish and use pemmican when I felt my energy lagging. We ate pemmican, if possible, at night meal. We would also eat pemmican at any time of day if a big portage or very bad stretch of polling was anticipated. It was splendid for restoring both strength and ambition. I think that the mental effect of pemmican, at least my own experience, is more important than we usually associate with food, and I am firmly convinced of its peculiar mentally stimulating qualities. End of that quote. On the Newellton Lake trip, when we had some pemmican, I never experienced fatigue sufficiently serious to really impede me. Later, I made a return trip and used the best available civilianized food, going on with freighting outfit of Indians and experienced extreme fatigue. There may have been other factors, but I know my own feeling was very strong for pemmican. An important thing with pemmican is that it seems to have relatively quick point of satiety. This is very important where both quantity and nutrition are considerations. In contrast to any known dry/condensed food, pemmican is a working food for that goes a very long way. So Downs, a man in his young 30s, is in agreement with Dr. Priestley, who was quoted on page 259 as saying, when he was in his 30s, 30 years ago, that would not have exchanged a serving of pemmican for twice its weight of any delicacy. In agreement, too, with Admiral Perry, who about 30 years ahead of Presley, and so on with the whole sequence of pemmican enthusiasts back to the 18th century, who have been quoted here, together with many others whom I did not quote for want of space. It would seem, then, that the liking of frontiersmen, explorers, sportsmen for pemmican has remained the same through all the generations back to the fur trade. How explain, then, the letter quoted from the office of Quartermaster General of the United States Army with regard to soldiers who say that lack of palatability or of pemmican, in our opinion, is sufficient reason for rejection? Still more difficult is it to reconcile that things with the results of the tests that made during World War II on men of Canadian Army under the supervision of a group of scientists with which international in their sense that they represented both the United States and Canada. For the report of this test shows that the soldiers were using pemmican under the watchful eyes of nutritionists, found both that the food is prohibitively unpalatable and that those who eat it cannot keep their strength on it. Interesting. I acknowledge it gratefully with permission which has been given to me to quote from the report of this test, though under the handicap that I must not reveal when or where the tests were done, nor by what scientists. No report of the experiment could be well more convincingly set up than the one which is about to be reviewed. The document carries the names, academic degrees, and military rank or civilian status, connection with respective institutions, of those who supervised the test and arrived at these conclusions. There is precise information on almost every conceivable phase of trial. There is a table of the results and graph. The report is stated on its first page is not official. The view expressed are those of the authors and not to be construed as the official endorsement of the government agency. The title of the document is Defects of Pemmican as an Emergency Ration for Infantry Troops. I quote with certain omissions, indicates by dots using enough of the documents, I feel, to bring out its true spirit in main conclusion. Sounds like somebody redacted it. Method. The maneuvers were held January and February. Temperature range from minus 31 F to plus 33 degrees F, with a mean of minus 3 degrees for the whole period. The troops were from 2nd Rifle Regiment, and the platoon which tested pemmican was particularly chosen because of its exceptional showing in physical fitness and test in morale during previous maneuvers in the same era. The commanding officer was an excellent leader, skilled in bushcraft. The platoon was provided with and knew how to use adequate Arctic protective clothing and equipment. They bivouacked throughout the test in a single spot, returning each evening after the day's problems. Energy expenditure in working was estimated an average of 4,500 calories daily. The ration consisted of food for one man for one day, pemmican made of dehydrated prime beef with added suet, 4 aluminum wrapped blocks, 27 ounces, tea in bags, G bags, cigarettes, 5 per package, 2 packages, matches, safety, 1 box, matches, book, 1 book, instructions for using rations, 1 sheet. The calories were 70% from fat and 30% from muscle. By analysis, the pemmican contained no ascorbic acid, only traces of riboflavin and thiamine. No extra salt had been added. The instruction sheet read as follows. 2 packages of dehydrated prime beef, added to it, I think it says 3/8 pound each. A concentrated ration. Must be eaten in small amounts. This ration is the most concentrated food known to man, and so there is danger of overeating. Taken in too large of amount at any one meal, it may nauseate you. Do not overeat. If you choose, you may carry the ration in your pocket and nibble on it on the march. Hot black tea will keep you alert and warm. Drink fairly large quantities of hot tea with meal. The ration is usually eaten cold, not necessarily frozen. Heating, which separates the fat from the lean, makes it difficult for some people to eat the ration or digest it properly. On days when heavy work is not done, you will not eat all your ration. Do not discard any part of it. Return what you do not eat to the quartermaster. The ration is expensive. In order to avoid prejudice, the word pemmican was never mentioned in front of the troops. A variety of observations were made during the test. Control observations were made on 3 other platoons, which were subsequent on adequate field rations, but undergoing the same rigors of the environment and work as a platoon on pemmican. Results. The work of the first day was hard and tiring. The men tired conspicuously to follow instructions. Nibbling at the pemmican throughout the day. Some heated it in boiling water, but the majority took it cold. At the end of the day, morale was not high. There were complaints about the food, and 11 out of 17, I think it says, men complained of nausea. The second was a trying day, with the men hauling fully loaded toboggans 13 miles in deep snow over brush and trail. In contrast to the usually cheerful adaptation of the previous test, the troops showed very poor morale and felt the cold so keenly that the wood fires had to be started at a noon halt. The platoon ate very little. 1 soldier vomited early in the morning. 1 was dizzy all day. 4 were nauseated all day, and 12 felt weak and tired. Pathological fatigue was evident, and it took 4 men to haul a toboggan, even on level snow, when only 2 would be ordinarily required. The third day brought the platoon to the point of disintegration as a military unit. A 15-mile reconnaissance was scheduled. 1 man vomited twice before starting, and 4 others were so weak and exhausted during the morning that they had to be taken back to camp in a truck. At the noon halt, the commanding officer decided that to complete the day's objective would risk too many casualties, so he turned back for the camp. All of the men were very weak and exhausted. A meeting of all the test personnel was held to decide what to do with the platoon. It was agreed that they would start out 3 days before in excellent physical condition and with fine morale, but had deteriorated to exhaustion. Unfit troops useless for military purposes. The line officers of the company agreed that if there had been actual combat between any of the 3 platoons and the platoon eating pemmican, the latter would have all been casualties by the end of the second day. As the platoon was useless operationally, it would have taken 2-bit base camp for a 36-hour study. On the morning of the 4th day, physical examination revealed a group of listless, dehydrated men with drawn faces and sunken eyeballs, whose breath smelled strongly of acetone. Neurologic changes were present in several. Tendon jerks were asymmetrical or absent. No other positive findings were recorded. Balance with respect to calories, water, salt, and vitamins showed striking changes. The average weight loss was 7 pounds in 3 days. Average caloric intake had been 1,500 calories daily, with a range from 8 to 3,800, and an estimated daily expenditure had been 4,000, 5,200, and 3,800 calories. The platoon suffered from dehydration, low chloride levels, and low vitamin C reserves, but showed no significant changes in vitamin B, vitamin B1, vitamin B2, or niacin as measured by factor F2. The platoon was and had for 2 days been suffering from a severe acidosis as evident by gross ketonuria and ketonemia. During these 2 days, medical examiners had already noticed acetone in high concentrations on their breath. Physical fitness was at a very low ebb, as was both the performance in the field and by the short test. 1 week previous to eating pemmican, They all had finished a route march of 47 miles in 36 hours. After 3 days of pemmican, they were unable to finish a 15-mile reconnaissance. As measured by the pack test, their fitness was extremely poor. The diagnosis was clearly caloric deficiency, with associated ketosis, dehydration, salt depletion, and ascorbic acid depletion. The chief difficulty was caloric deficiency with associated ketosis. As was shown by feeding the platoon a high-caloric carbohydrate diet consisting of toast, jam, hot sugar tea with added condensed milk. Breakfast being at 8 a.m. and lunch at 12:30 p.m. Figure 6, a group photograph shows the extremely rapid improvement in fitness and decreased ketonuria. Symptomatic recovery was equally rapid. The average voluntary caloric intake on this one day was estimated to be about 7,500 calories. Thus did a rigidly controlled scientific test demonstrate in 3 days that those had been misled who had inferred from records of the fur trade and from current tests such as that of Earl P. Hansen, given in Chapter 6. The soldiers, like sportsmen and explorers, could remain in good health and full strength for long periods on pemmican as the sole food. The supervising committee now faced allegations that pemmican is a good chief item in a mixed diet. Admiral Perry, for instance, has testified in his book that men have done well for at least 3 months on a ration of 3 factors only: a pound of pemmican a day, a pound of hard bread, and tea. This would be a ration where sustainability more than half of the calories were derived from pemmican. The Drawbacks of Pemmican report deals with such allegations as Perry's. On the 5th day, the platoon was transported again to its bivouac area and was offered the considerable misgiving a ration containing pemmican 13.5 ounces, pilot biscuit 10 ounce, rolled oats 5 ounce, evaporated milk 5 ounce, sugar 3 ounce, tea 6 ounce, salt 1 ounce, match packages 2, and cigarettes 10. Approximately 5,000 calories a day was offered to each man, much to the surprise of observers who thought that the troops had such a distaste for pemmican that they would never touch it again in any form. The men made a hot mixture of pemmican with biscuits or oatmeal and found that fairly acceptable for the next 6 days. They remarked repeatedly that they appreciated very much having sugar for their tea and salt for their pemmican, neither of which had been issued during the first 3 days. Considering their extreme weakness and general uselessness on the 3rd day of the excessive pemmican diet, the men performed fairly well for the rest of the test, and all completely a force marched 46 miles in 35 hours at the end. They seemed to have enough energy to complete all of the problems, and almost as well as other 3 platoons, but were usually very tired at night. Many of the soldiers complained that they never did feel normally fit, and in fact, they did not recover their normal physical fitness until they had been rested for a week on a good garrison ration. Morale in the last 6 days of the test was good. Performance and energy picked up tremendously. Physical fitness improved, and at the end of the medical and nutritional abnormalities had disappeared. Discussion. The chief evidence of the proponents of pemmican as an emergency ration is the performance of explorers in cold climates. We had made a complete search of the literature in order to determine exactly how pemmican has been used. To the best of our knowledge, no party has ever reported living on pemmican alone. It has always been used along with a variety of other components, commonly including biscuits, cereal products. The result of the thorough literature search indicates clearly that pemmican has never been used as a sole component of an emergency ration, and that it has proved unsatisfactory when used as a major part of the ration. Present experience leads to the conclusion that pemmican is undesirable as a component of military emergency ration. In the face of so clear-cut a verdict by dietitians who have conducted so rigorous an experiment as is here described, running 3 days on exclusive pemmican and 6 on pemmican as one of the several ingredients, it is of only passing in interest to mention a few anomalies. The report says, for instance, that the chief evidence of the proponent of pemmican as an emergency ration is the performance of explorers in cold climate. This is a remarkable allegation, for most or all of the proponents known to me have emphasized that pemmican was originally in the main a summer ration. More pemmican was surely used in one summer by the fur traders than had been used in 100 winters by all the polar explorers. The reports say, we have had a complete search of the literature in order to determine exactly how pemmican has been used, but the biography submitted in support of the statement is of less than 100 books, none of them which contained any extensive discussion of the use of pemmican by the fur trade, or indeed by anyone except the polar explorers. Thus, the thorough literature search is based on works that could only 1 or 2% of the total known use. Nor is it a fair sampling of the literature, since the small fraction examined was taken from a restricted group, the polar explorers, omitting such other groups as the fur traders, overland explorers, and sportsmen. A striking illustration of the manner in which trained scientists can discover things to which the layman is blind appears in a long table which is based on the mentioned complete search of literature. I, for one, suffered with a feeling of bewildered incompetence when I find the committee of nutritionists analyzing my own report and arriving at conclusions the opposite of mine. However, this is perhaps not so very strange, for traveling parties of which I have been a member live in the main by hunting, so we had little occasion to use pemmican. The truly remarkable thing is how the scientists, by a study of Admiral Peary's record, arrived at a conclusion opposite to his. What Peary's were, the reader can remind himself by turning back to page 275 to 258 of this volume, or how better, through reading the entire pemmican section in Peary's own Secret of Parlor Travel, pages 77 through 83. It be noted here that Peary's verdict includes his saying that to him pemmican was the only indispensable food, and that he and his men never got tired of it, though they ate it every meal for months, and that it is the most satisfying food I know. How far in the wrong Peary was in his conclusion, according to at least some nutritionists who have read his books, appears in the analysis of the experience with pemmican by the report under discussion. It finds that as a result of using pemmican for chief ingredients in a ration, the other elements of which were biscuits and tea, Peary's men showed exhaustion, accumulative weariness, suffered from cold, and insomnia. The report does not specify on what food a party would not suffer from accumulative weariness. For instance, toward the end of Peary's North Pole journey, when he and his men had traveled 900 miles and more in 63 days, not merely walking over the drifting floes of the Arctic Sea, but for a part of the time helping the dogs to drag the sleds. Nor does the report enter into the details of the food Peary should have used to avoid suffering from cold, ignoring the point that he claims his men suffered less from cold than usual in the polar work. As to the insomnia, Peary dwells on this especially for the periods when he was just approaching and just leaving the pole, as well as while he was there. The insomnia that an analysis of the dietitian's trace to the pemmican that being eaten. Peary had thought it due to mental suspense when he was about to reach the goal of his life's work, and to excitement following the attainment of what had been his main purpose throughout all the years from 1866 to 1909. But even the scientists were wrong in the interpretation, and Peary right. That would not be much of a point. The fact would remain, through a rigorous demonstration of 9 days, the nutritionist had arrived at a conclusion irreconcilable, not merely with experience of Peary and the other explorers, but with the far longer, broader experience of the fur trade. The scientists who conducted the test on which the defects of pemmican report is based may have been even so unaware of the history of pemmican and ever so careless in this use of the limited collection of books of which they were aware. To judge by the biography, they made up for all of this through being meticulous about their field studies. For instance, in order to avoid prejudice, the word pemmican was never mentioned in front of the troops. Then the camera was used to reinforce what might otherwise have found it hard to believe, and we are shown, photograph of a sturdy young man, flat on his back, confirm, as the legend says, that on the second day excessive fatigue was apparent. In view of all this and more, the line officers of the company agreed that if there had been actual combat between any of the other platoons and the platoon eating pemmican, the latter would have all been casualties by the end of the second day. With such a condition facing them, that what else could military nutritionists do but find against pemmican as a military ration? We are in a dilemma, and then between two clear-cut, diametrically opposed verdicts. The one in favor of pemmican was arrived at it by historians primarily from the evidence of fur traders and secondarily from the testimony of explorers and sportsmen. The verdict against has been arrived by science from the testimony of soldiers, buttressed by what the nutritionists and the camera have seen in confirmation. We might speculate on resolving this dilemma. It has been suggested that explorers and sportsmen welcome pemmican as a diet because they are interested in what they are doing and willing, if not eager, to use whatever food serves their ends more satisfactorily. While it is assumed that soldiers is not interested in his job and therefore less willing, if not defiantly unwilling, to change from the accustomed food. There has been the suggestion, too, that the tests made by the explorers and the fur traders are truly physiologic in their nature, psychology playing a minor part and a favorable one, since these men, before they ever tasted pemmican, were predisposed for it by what they had read and heard. The soldiers are supposed to be predisposed against pemmican is indicated by the report I have quoted, where it says that the supervisory officials were careful not to mention the word pemmican in the presence of the men, in order to avoid prejudicing them. However, it is difficult to see whence the food could have received a bad reputation, since nearly everyone who had written about it from the earliest times to the present have favorable immediate satisfactoriness for a day of hard work upon long-term satisfaction with months on end were required, and especially upon palatability. It has been suggested that pemmican is thought by soldiers to have been invented by Eskimos, which is supposed to antagonize them. This is on the assumption that soldiers, like the nutritionists who handled the Canadian test, believe pemmican to be, historically speaking, a cold weather food only. Since none of these solutions appear satisfactory, the debate remains impaled on the horns of dilemma. However, the military test results is unfavorable. Verdicts have been so far only cold weather tests, and pemmican was originally a summer food used by the fur trader of the plains during the open season, when the rivers were flowing and when temperatures could soar to 100 in the shade, with the men laboring under a burning sun. From this angle, possibly significant evidence has been recently to the effect that businessmen and engineers are deeply concerned about the lack of energy shown by Europeans in tropical climate, and that they think they may have found a solution. It appears that many from these two groups and some psychologists and medical men are increasingly of the view that a lack of energy observed among white men in the tropics, as compared to with natives, may be due to the effect of the climate as such upon Europeans, but may instead be caused by dietetics. By his dietetics, I think it says, his belief that meat, lean, and fat, but particularly the fat, should be avoided. Accordingly, we learn that some of the large rubber plantations in Africa and elsewhere are thinking of increasing experimentally the meat element in the diets of their white employees, giving them both more lean and more fat, but particularly more fat. It may be, then, that pemmican, temporarily successfully in cold weather among the polar explorers, is about to return to its original function as a hot weather diet. That is the end of Chapter 13 of Fat of the Land. Thanks for listening. Sorry for all the stumbling. I am not a good reader, but one of the reasons why I did this is because there's a lot of people out there like myself that are dyslexic, or they have visual problems, or all kinds of other problems. They can't read this book for themselves, and it's not available in audio form. So I was happy to be a part of this, and I want to thank everybody who got involved and made this happen, and hopefully we'll do some more books. Thanks again, especially to A. Dave Fox, the Black Carnivore.